In this episode, we are covering an important topic for the healing journey, and that is the vagus nerve. I'm joined by Ami Brannon. Ami is a co founder of Neuvana and was the company's chief executive officer in its startup phase. She currently serves as chief revenue officer, focusing on marketing, sales, and the customer experience. She's devoted to optimizing wellness and mental health through neuroscience to fight the devastating health effects of stress induced illness. Ami is a registered nurse with over 20 years' experience in hospital based healthcare. She served both in clinical and leadership roles in ICU and invasive procedural areas. Ami holds a BS in nursing and a BS in psychology from the University of Central Florida. I'm very excited to have you here today with me, Ami. The goal is really just to kind of go through what is our vagus nerve? How can we support it and get people to start thinking about this topic? So, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm super excited. I think it'll be a fun conversation.
So, do you want to? People know your background, right? It's like you are a nurse for a really long time. Um, what made you get started with focusing so much on the vagus nerve? I know you have the BS in psychology, so I'm sure that has something to do with it.
Yeah, it winds up just being convenient that I have that background. When I met one of the surgeons that I worked with at the hospital for years, he had invented numerous medical devices, and his brother, also a physician, was using something in his pain practice that actually targeted the vagus nerve. So it looked like that's what was happening, but it involved needles and that just seemed really invasive. And when we looked at it, it seemed like you could access this branch of the vagus nerve through the ear canal. So the vagus nerve, just kind of back up on that. It actually is one of your cranial nerves. So it comes out two sides of the back of the brain stem and then comes down the neck and wires together basically in one cable and reaches all the major organ systems in your body. But also, this little branch comes through the ear. So that branch, the only direction that that branch goes is to send messages to the brain. So the rest of the vagus nerve goes two ways. So it communicates from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. But this one little branch of the nerve is kind of like the doorbell for the brain. So that's kind of what I call it. When you stimulate it, and we use electrical stim for that, then it's kind of like, hey, wake up, vagus nerve. It's time to do your thing.
I love that doorbell for the brain. I'm gonna make a note, make sure that's in the social media. It's because it's a big concept, right? It's a lot to explain to people. We haven't even talked about the nervous system yet because the vagus nerve is part of that.
Right.
But I feel like little analogies like that can make this more it feel more applicable to be like, okay, but what is how does this actually apply to me in my life?
Right. And it's funny when you think to historically, when you think of children who are tired or need to self-soothe, it seems like so many of them rub their ears. And that's thought to be connected to the fact that the vagus nerve, which is a very calming, it accesses the calming side of the nervous system, that even children recognize that and that's why they will rub their ear. So pulling might be an ear infection, but rubbing might be self-soothing.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I know before we got on, I mentioned I was just talking with my friend Leah about the lymphatic system and all that, and how there's like a huge ear focus, and there's a lot of massage techniques and stuff you can do on your ears to help stimulate that parasympathetic state. And it makes sense because it sounds like we can connect with our vagus nerve there.
Right. Yeah, it's super convenient. And there are different spots on the ear. We target the ear canal, and then the very front of the ear has that little triangle piece that sticks out just a little bit. But that's known to have a lot of the nerve fibers from this branch of the vagus nerve.
That is so interesting. And we'll talk all about that electrical kind of stimulation and Zen and how you can different tools that you guys can utilize. Um, so before we dive into all the kind of big concepts around the vagus nerve, what can you talk a little bit about the nervous system and the two branches of it so that we can kind of better understand where that vagus nerve lives?
Sure. So you have your there's a part of your nervous system that is completely automatic. Okay, and it's called the autonomic nervous system, but you can think of it as the automatic. You don't have to think about anything. These are the things that run in the background. So the two sides that we're most familiar with is the fight or flight. Some people say fight, flight, or freeze, or fright, flight. There's all these little words that people try to use all kinds of words in there. But this is the part that gears you up for something. It's important. So stress is important in our lives. So I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to cancel stress, right? Stress is actually what makes you stronger, mentally stronger, emotionally stronger, physically stronger when you put your body under stress. It's ongoing stress, chronic stress that is not managed, or you don't give yourself time to recover, that becomes a problem. So if you're in this fight or flight stage, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure will go up, your focus is very different, and you are targeted to protect yourself, right? So you're fleeing from the tiger that's chasing you. Whereas the opposite side of that is to help recover from those episodes. So this is the drop in respiratory rate. So you're breathing slower, deeper, your heart rate drops, your blood pressure drops, your food digests. This is your rest and digest side. The the issue that we have now, and I think all of us could argue that over the last 2 years, the onslaught of new information that is very stressful is continuous. Many of us may have had family members who were ill or isolated or even passed during the pandemic. I mean, there's been a lot of awful things going on, and that's notwithstanding social issues and political, all these things that come at us that we have strong opinions about, but actually create some sort of visceral response. So if you have all of those things and you don't have a good tone to your nervous system, and now you're in gear all the time, then that's what starts causing chronic disease. And you had asked earlier about, kind of what was my attraction to this whole project and looking at the vagus nerve. Well, as an ICU nurse, I would take care of the sickest of the sick. And in that environment, I could see every day that so many of those situations could have been avoided, but they would have had to have been avoided years ago, right? So it's when we're in our 20s, we kind of think that we're invincible and we don't have to worry about all these things that come later in life. And we're in our 30s, we're gearing through the career and you building family, and but you still have to give yourself these exercises, these tools to recover so that long term, your body and your brain and your organs are still in good shape to keep you, you know, when all of those things are past and you want to have fun in life.
I think too, when you think about how our bodies are designed, and I've probably said this so many people probably sick of hearing me say this on this podcast, but we're not designed to constantly be in fight or flight, right? We're not designed to always be in that sympathetic nervous system state. And like you said, it is healthy for us, to get in and then get out. And I think that's the part that a lot of us are missing is the getting out part because we are kind of stuck
Right.
in this state of high stress. I mean, if you think about it, screens are super stimulating. They're that blue light that they emit and everything. It's like most of us are spending the majority of our days in fight or flight and we don't realize it. And then, we might think, oh, I don't have that much stress. But then, I think of the people that have a really hard time sitting in quiet or slowing down or like sitting down eating a
Mhm.
meal and not rushed or without distractions. It's like those are all signs that you are probably addicted to cortisol and addicted to that stress response because that's all that your body really knows, and it gets like stuck in that nervous system state. And when we think about what does a healthy nervous system look like, it's going in and out, right? It's getting to the stress
Mhm.
state and then coming back down to that relaxed state. And like you said, the last 2 years have been in an already stressful world, like the way of life that we have now in our society. We add on top of that this huge chronic stress that we think is going to end. It feels like it never does. And then adding into that, like illness, not being able to see family, isolation, like all those things. Of course, that's going to push people past that. breaking point, and I think it's just really messed with a lot of people's nervous systems, and now they don't have that healthy stress response.
Yeah, I think that's all those are all really good points, and I look at it even for myself. There'll be times if so I make a lot of decisions on a daily basis. If I find myself having a hard time making a decision and second guessing a lot of things, there's like too much rumination going on, then I know something's off because I should be able to focus, make a decision, not spend so much time second guessing. But that's just me knowing myself. And if I'm irritable, I have, less tolerance for conversation or for human interaction, then I know my nervous system is way off. So, and that's if we look at the product that we have or vagus nerve stimulation in general, I'll say we'll talk about meditation for a minute. A lot of people believe that meditation and mindfulness will help stimulate the vagus nerve. So while it may do that indirectly, um, people who are consistent meditators know when they're not meditating. They see the they're off kilter when they're not doing that. And so I would say it's the same. That's what I notice.
Yeah, you have less resiliency to stress because your body's not
Yes.
getting out of that state enough. Um,
Right.
so we talked about like the two different nervous systems. Where does the vagus nerve come in? The rest and digest?
Yes. So the vagus nerve is really the major portion of the rest and digest side of the nervous system. And when you stimulate it, then it lets the brain send messages to the body that say, okay, it's time to slow the breathing down, slow your heart rate down a little bit, digest the food. And even there are parts of the brain that are associated with focus. So the vagus nerve is also very associated with increased focus. So you can sit down at whatever you're doing and have this really nice hyper focus on typing a report, or if you're up against a deadline, if you have to do your taxes and you don't want to, all of those things that will just help you move through some things a little bit faster.
I didn't realize the focus piece of it. Like
Hmm.
I always think of the digestive system and gut health because there's
Hmm.
such a big piece of communication there. And if you're not digesting your food well, then that will lead to gut health issues down the road. Our stomach acid is that first line of defense. And if we are not getting into that relaxed state before we're eating, then we're not going to make the digestive juices that we need. So then our food doesn't get broken down,
Hmm.
doesn't get processed correctly. We don't get the nutrients, it ferments, we get gut bacteria overgrowth, all that fun stuff, right? So I always make that big connection, but I'm really glad you mentioned the energy piece or the focus piece because I do think a lot
Hmm.
of people could relate to that. And a lot of people have a hard time focusing now. I mean, you're in the marketing, right? Obviously, I'm doing social media and stuff for my business. And a huge battle is people's attention spans and getting them to
Hmm.
want to listen to a longer podcast and not just like look at an image or watch a reel on Instagram, like the 15-second clips and stuff. So it makes sense because I think a lot of us are so sympathetic, dominant in stress that like we can't quite
Hmm.
get into that relaxed, focused state.
Right. And it's so even on functional MRI in a bunch of different studies, they show that when electrical stim is applied to the vagus nerve, that this part of the brain lights up called the locus coeruleus, and that is what releases norepinephrine into the system. So it's then you get these folks in really hyper focused states.
Okay, that's really interesting. Um, So, how does our vagus nerve, as far as like you talked about how if you notice you're feeling off, right? Like maybe you don't have like the same resiliency to stress, conversation, you can't make decisions, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
How does the vagus nerve lead to that? Like how is it going to impact that?
So when you I think knowing yourself is really important, right? And you had mentioned that a lot of people don't realize the amount of stress they're under. So even if we can just peel it back and say, maybe you don't have to admit or see how much stress you're under. Maybe you just need to pay attention to how you interact with others, how you make decisions, how you spend your time, um, what makes you exhausted, what gives you energy, and how you're spending your time, and call it stress or call it something else. I think some people shy away from it because it's such an overused word.
Yeah.
Um, but when you practice getting yourself into a relaxed state, that triggers the activity of the vagus nerve. Now, what I've seen over the last several years in building this company and talking with so many different people is that a lot of us don't even know what relaxation feels like. So let's take a person who might have had a difficult childhood. Um, may then have gone into this mode that I'm going to be super successful, and so they overcome all odds. So now they're a super type A personality, very control, everything is control, right? So they don't even know what it feels like to relax. So meditation is impossible. And how many people have you talked to that say, I can't do it. I can't sit still that long. I can't be quiet for that long. So this is sort of a hack. Stimulating the vagus nerve is a bit of a hack to get past that. So it's not saying it replaces anything necessarily. It could, but I think everybody needs tools in the toolbox. So you need to be able to access your vagus nerve somehow. And there are thoughts plunging into an ice bath does it. Well, I don't want to do that. I live in South Florida for a reason, and ice bath sounds miserable to me. It's really exciting for some people, but definitely not for me. So that's not a tool I would use. Um, so in this case, we have electrical stim that is a direct line to the vagus nerve, and that helps jump that step.
And I think too, an important thing to mention is a lot of people's nervous systems cannot handle an ice bath. Like their adrenals literally just can't handle it. It would be because
Yeah,
that's a positive stressor, right? So even though
right.
it does stimulate that vagus nerve, or like I mean, contrast showers are an easy one for people to like slowly start implementing. But honestly, even sometimes that can feel too stressful. A hot bath I've had be too stressful
Hmm.
for people. So that's one of the things I love about the Zen, that little cool little earpiece product that Neuvana makes, because you can control the level of stimulation that you are giving to the vagus nerve. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. I want to share my experience. I'm curious of your feedback on it,
All
and like
right.
what it means, because I've noticed like trends over since like, oh my gosh, what has it been like 6 months now? I think I've been using it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that'll be interesting. But the whole kind of going back to the stress, or like identifying your stress, whatever people want to call it. One thing I think people are becoming more aware of now is their stress their whole life, and like trauma, how whatever you want to call it.
Hmm.
I feel like that's another one of those buzzwords that people are like, I don't know if I want to call it trauma.
Hmm.
um, Even though it's not the trauma, it's how your body reacts to it that's important. We had a great podcast episode about that with Teresa from Living Roots Wellness, if you guys want to go back and listen. And we talked about like little t versus big T trauma, but also just doesn't matter what it was, it just matters how your body, what kind of response it had. And I'm just interested and curious of like how you see that impacting vagus nerve, especially like later in life, where we think like I'm over all of that, like I'm past that, but I'm still dealing with all these health issues.
Yeah. Wow, it's a really interesting question, and I'll say a little bit loaded. And I'm sure you understand because I hear the big T, little T, and I'll have to go back and listen to that podcast episode myself. Um, what I see, and I being associated and really overseeing the whole customer experience, I talk with a lot of customers directly. If I see something that looks interesting and I want to learn more, then I'll reach out and talk to a customer directly as well. And we have had a few people with traumatic backgrounds, so traumatic experience in the past that they have not resolved. And so I had talked to a customer who said, I actually get a little bit anxious. So I'm relating to your comments about a bath or a shower that actually can increase anxiety. So the story there is when you start bringing down the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight. So you start bringing it down, it almost creates this situation where the brain now sees what they've been hiding, right? So we lock some things up in boxes and we put them away for a reason. But we also have professionals to help us unlock the box in a safe way, right? So I would say that when trauma is being, and I'll call it trauma for the sake that I think that's what everyone will understand, but these traumatic experiences, if people haven't dealt with them, they will continue to create this sympathetic overload in your whole body, which creates chronic disease, early aging, it diabetes, heart disease, insomnia, depression. So if you can go ahead and commit to resolving that with a professional, do cognitive behavioral therapy, find a professional that fits with you, and something like one of these things, whether it's vagus nerve stimulation through electrical stim or through a different series of activities that you're doing, it's so important because that high level sympathetic load has to come down to save all of your organs. But the parasympathetic, that rest and digest, also needs to come up so that you can help save your emotions and your brain, and you can be more resilient with the way you respond to things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I always think of it from like a nutrient and mineral perspective because that's what I spend most of my time looking at, like hair
Right.
mineral tests. And the people that they've been in that fight or flight for a really long time, most of them are what's called a fast four. And they have very low depleted mineral levels. So it means that fast means that their body is still in the fight or flight, that sympathetic state. And then the number next to the metabolic type, the four, that is describing what their thyroid and their adrenals are doing. And so a one is like everything is fast, which a fast one, that would be like a healthy stress response, right? Everything is nothing
Mhm.
is dysregulated. It's all working as it should. The further you get out to three, and then when you finally hit four, that means that your thyroid and adrenals are burnt out. They don't have the mineral resources anymore to respond properly to the stress. So not only is it that you're stuck in this fight or flight state, so of course that's going to lead to thyroid issues, hormone imbalances, of course, digestive issues like we talked about previously, but also deficiencies because you're using up these minerals, you're burning through them at a faster rate. So that's like the first thing I think
Mhm.
of. And it's like, it's uncomfortable when you first start trying to get out of that state because you're used to being in the fight or flight. Whether you have a good response to stress or not, your body's used to the stress hormones.
Right. Yeah, that's it. I like the word uncomfortable, because that lets you see it's not dangerous. Right. It's and in order sometimes in order to get where we want to be, we have to cross through that uncomfortable zone.
So, do you find that like for those people that maybe they feel like they're like I have been in fight or flight my whole life. If they think back to childhood, and that's something I had people do in
Mhm.
my course is it's like your stress journey, right? Because we want to understand, okay, so we see this hair test now, it's looking at the last 3 months, but how did we get here? Because you could be in a place where you're eating really well now and you're trying, maybe you have reduced a lot of stressors in your life and you kind of feel like I feel like I've done all the things, but we kind of come to realize, oh, when I think back of my childhood, like maybe you moved a ton, maybe your parents got a divorce, maybe you had digestive issues your whole life growing up and you
Mhm.
never associated that with being stressed as a kid, but it was, and like you've had constipation or gut issues for a long time. All those things are going to impact your health today. um, And so I feel like it's like understanding that is helpful, but then, what can we start to do to combat that? Would that just be to like slowly start implementing that vagus nerve stimulation?
Yes. Yep, exactly that. It's slow. So little bits at a time. Even though we recommend when people are just starting, so the average person, let's say, whatever that looks like, but sort of the average person would be twice a day, 15 minutes for 3 weeks, just to give yourself the chance to do this um, and see results, because sometimes it does take about that long to see results. But someone who may have had um, trauma in the past, unresolved issues, very, very, if they start using it and it feels like you start feeling that anxiety creep up, then just a couple minutes at a time. And still daily, but couple minutes at a time. And then if it's something you have not resolved and you're not sure where all this is coming from, then I would say that you need to talk to a professional and see if you can sort through what's really going on.
Yeah, we can't leave out that other. It's like everything goes together, right? Like I find
Yes.
I have a lot of clients that will do talk therapy and it's helpful to a point, but then they hit a wall and they
Hmm.
feel like they're kind of not getting beyond that. And then it's like the other piece where it's like if you try to do too much on your own, then all this stuff comes up and you don't quite have the tools to deal with it, and you can kind of feel like you're going backwards. So I love the idea of like marrying
Right.
them together. Do you want to talk a little bit about some signs that your vagus nerve needs support? And like you said, nervous system tone before. Can you talk like what does that mean? Like a lot of people, I feel like it's usually like vagal tone. Like, what's your vagus? Do you have good vagal tone? What does that mean?
Right.
And how do people know they might need that support?
So, a lot of time, vagal tone is kind of a newer term, and it depends on who's defining it. So I read constantly. So even if our studies, with our device, we may not have 27,000 studies, but Google Scholar does, right? So I am constantly reading all the different studies on vagus nerve stimulation, and vagal tone is something that typically it's how quickly your heart can get in and out of a rapid beat,
Okay.
right? So it's typically measured with heart rate variability. Now, of course, nothing is just that simple. There are 100 different ways to measure heart rate variability, and you can look at little bits and pieces. Um, but in general, most people are going to look at their aura ring, at their HRV strap, whatever they're using, if they look at HRV. I would say so that's one way to look at it. Higher HRV shows that you have heart rate variability, meaning there's more variability between beat to beat. So not an arrhythmia, which is something that is not normal. This is normal. It goes up and down with the flow of your breathing. Okay. So that means that your heart is actually more resilient, and if you're running a really high heart rate all the time, you're going to have um, fewer longer spaces in between those beats, right? So everything is like too fast. So when other signs for vagal tone, if you don't track and measure things, maybe that even stresses you out. Sometimes that happens, right? If we track too much, it's irritability, digestion, um, tolerance to new information. And that's an anecdotal comment from me, but I will say if you really, really are any new information that comes at you, you are super annoyed, irritable, you want to crawl into a hole, then your nervous system is probably just like on fire, and you need to get that under control somehow.
And I always think about like, I mean, now it's like hard not to have information overload in the world that we live in. Like we
Right.
take in, we're not meant, if we look at, how we evolved, it's like we're not meant to know what's happening beyond like a 10-mile radius. And now we know what's happening like all over the world, constantly at our fingertips, which can be very
Mhm.
stressful. And even just coming into contact with so many people. I mean, think about like scrolling on social media, you see what so many people are doing. And it's just one of those things where it's like, yeah, that should be overwhelming because ideally, like, be in your typical like village, it wouldn't be more than like 150 people, but most of us are following thousands of people on social media. So I feel like it's like one aspect of this is like information overload and putting devices down so that
Mhm.
that's probably great for your vagus nerve.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that we have to develop guardrails for ourselves. So you said something earlier that, people are kind of looking for one thing, or looking for something, a quick fix or one thing, and it's just not. We have to discipline ourselves first of all into some sort of a routine that's good for us. So sometimes easier said than done. I get that. I have 3 kids, and I've had one career while doing another one at night. I've done all that, so I get it. But we do have to put pieces together that are good for us. So if you know that your tendency is to incessantly scroll on social, then you probably need to set a timer before you start, right? So little things. I mean, these are simple little things that we can do. If you know you struggle going to sleep or falling asleep right away, then you need to set a routine around bedtime. And if you tend to overcommit, then it's time to start practicing saying no, and start with something easy. Start with something super easy and then get that into practice. But we have to learn to put these processes around the tools. So we can't just have tools, and we can't just have processes sometimes because life is too fast. So we may need both.
I like that. It's very strategic and it can be personalized to you. And I think it helps you too, like build more of a habit. 'Cause if you like tag a habit onto another habit, it's a lot easier. Like if you
Mhm.
already have the habit of going on your phone, whenever you get a break, you can tag on to that habit. I'm going to set a timer. I actually have like one of those little like egg timers on my desk. I use it more for work than anything. Like I'll like set it work without distractions for a certain amount of time. It goes off. I'll go
Mhm.
take a break, go do something. But I really like the idea of setting like just like having a boundary for yourself because it's think about it like something like watching TV or being on your phone or on a screen, it's addictive. It's meant to be that way. And
Yes.
it's like
Right.
it is our normal and healthy response to not want to get off of those devices. So
Mhm.
it's more of just it's like combating the things that are normal and accepted in our society with these little tools so that you're just kind of everything's kind of working against our health and the way that our bodies are designed, and it's just you kind of coming back at that and being like, okay, well, how can I make this a little bit healthier for me?
Right. Exactly. And like I'm at the point in my life where my kids are getting older. I have 2 in college and 1 in high school, and so I'm looking past that now. So I'm looking at, oh my gosh, I want to be able to play with, if my kids choose to have kids, then I want to be able to play with their kids and not not have an illness that I could have prevented.
Yeah, definitely puts it in perspective. So what
Yeah.
are some of the other ways we'll talk about the actual Zen device and like go into like what it is? Obviously, it's using that stimulation in the inner ear. But what are some other ways that we can support our vagus nerve in our day to day?
So in general, supporting your vagus nerve is eating healthy, right? Whole foods. I don't think enough emphasis can be put on whole foods. Whatever whatever form of diet you choose is up to you, and I think you obviously coach people on this on a daily basis. Second is exercise. You have to be able to stress your body a little bit And we all hear different things, whether it's 10 minutes a day of sustained cardiovascular exercise, or 20 minutes, or 180 minutes a week. Start somewhere. If you're not doing anything, you have to start somewhere. So, um, I, Jim Quick, who's very well known for memory and learning and all of that, one of his tricks is small successes, right? You take tiny goals and start with that. So even with your vagus nerve, you got to be moving. So if you can't move your legs, you move your arms, but you need to get your body moving. Whole foods, sleep. And some of these things are going to have to be helped with vagus nerve stimulation
Yeah.
because they're too difficult for some people. Like sleep is one of the biggest issues that we're all having right now. We've seen a huge uptick in people with sleep problems. So having a toned vagus nerve allows you to fall asleep easier, stay asleep longer, and go into a deeper sleep overnight.
Yeah, I use my
So I would say, I
phone
mean,
before bed, so I can attest to that.
before bed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that these are things people are probably tired of hearing them, but guys, it's really seems pretty simple. Whole foods, exercise, sleep, water.
And I think it's like it's making the time for it, and that's I know I get a
Mhm.
lot of questions, like people want a fancy supplement or like some specific regimen. They want something specific. They have this health issue, this main health concern. Usually, like for a lot of my population, it's like maybe it's PCOS, maybe it's hypothyroidism or an
Mhm.
autoimmune thyroid condition, endometriosis, and they're like, but what should I do? And I'm like, it's not really different. Like there's definitely nuances, of course, and you can get more specific if you get any sort of lab testing done, but at the end of the day, the foundation, you can't skip the foundations. Like you just can't, because they're going to
Right.
impact everything else.
Right. Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it. This is start here.
And I think eating enough, like that is something that is so underappreciated, especially for women. And,
Mhm.
if you're in that fight or flight, stressed out state a lot, you're probably not going to have great appetite. And it's going to be a lot harder for you to want to eat throughout the day. And then you're starving at the end of the day and you eat a ton of food, then you don't sleep good. It's like this vicious cycle. So the little things of how I always talk about, like eating breakfast after you get up, eating regularly throughout the day, not skipping meals, that's a great way to handle one of the biggest stressors your body deals with all day, and that's balancing your blood sugar. It's like if we can support this simple process, we're going to have way less spikes in cortisol, which is a huge one of the reasons things I hear about women on their healing journeys a lot when they start eating enough and like balancing their meals and eating more whole foods is they have more energy and more stuff starts to come up for
Mhm.
them because they have the energy to deal with it now after like being, like you said, being in that fight or flight for so long and like suppressing all that stuff.
Right. One thing that we didn't mention earlier is how stress adds to inflammation, and how inflammation is really at the crux of so many of these um, illnesses or disease processes, whatever. But it's everything from depression is now the research around depression right now is being linked to inflammation. You have everything from joint problems, arthritis, bowel issues, and all of those things are made worse when your inflammation is on fire, which, if your nervous system is out of balance, then you're just adding to that inflammation because that rest and digest side has an anti inflammatory effect.
And I mean, hopefully it helps make people feel better that things are simple, that it's not something super fancy that they have to do. I mean, yeah, it can be hard because then you realize, oh, I have to kind of deal with this now, and I don't really want to. Maybe you don't want to address it, but even starting very
Mhm.
slow and really small, like you said, like getting those quick wins in the beginning. I mean, that's really what it's all about. If you don't eat breakfast, just start with eating breakfast. That's what I usually have people do, and then that will help
Mhm.
stimulate your appetite all day, and then that will encourage you to want to eat more and want to prioritize it. And then maybe when you're eating enough, you actually want to move and get exercise in. And then eventually, once you get that eating and movement and getting outside in, that can really help with your sleep and your circadian rhythm.
Yep. All of that. Totally agree.
And then when you have
Yeah, I
an
like
oh, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say I like how you put that, sometimes if we realize it's that simple, it can be frustrating because it's the same message that we've heard for a long time, and we feel like maybe there is that fancy supplement or that something that would just fix what we've got instead of putting a little bit of work in.
Yeah.
And it once you start creating those habits, then they just come easier. Once you start learning how to relax, or once you learn how to get your eating routine down and prep your food or buy where to buy your food. Sometimes that's half the battle is just if forget to make food, where do I get it?
Yeah. Or if like
Mhm.
life gets really crazy and busy and you're in like a super stressful
Yes.
season. That's the other thing is like, yes, we're gonna go through stressful seasons where we have more stuff going on and we there's not enough hours in the day. And it's like you have to just do the best you can with what you have during
Yep.
those times. But then adding in like tools, like additional things, like how you mentioned like ice baths and stuff. It's like if you're not eating enough and you're super stressed out and you're not sleeping well, your digestion sucks, like probably not gonna like move the needle, right? So it's like, of course, we want to do the foundations first. Um, but I'm curious, like, for people that do feel like they have a hard time calming down, or they think they hear meditation, they're like, ooh, no, nope, rather not. Um, with something like that tool of like that electrical stimulation in the ear, that's what the Zen does. I feel like that's when it can be helpful when you are working on these other areas and you have a good foundation, then you can kind of build off of that. So do you want to talk about like what is this Zen? You talked about some of that electrical stimulation in the ear and how it connects to the vagus nerve, but like how can people actually use it?
Sure. Where's mine? I got it over here. So, the Zen is a portable vagus nerve stimulator. It uses mild electrical stim. So you can feel a little bit of either some people say it feels like a vibration, it might just feel warm. You can change the intensity so it can be really uncomfortable, but that's not the goal, right? So we all have different skin resistance. So that's why we have this intensity that you can change. But it sends electrical stim through an earbud that's really simple. They just look like in ear headphones. And you pop the left one, is the one that delivers the electrical stim. You can listen to your music or your podcast while you're doing it. So we have a couple of different modes. The electrical stim is designed to stimulate this branch of the vagus nerve that's on the front and the back of the ear canal. So when you put this in, you spray a little saline on it just to help with conductivity, and you can the app. So there's an app that is you can think of it as your remote control, right? So you can choose different waveforms, and that in and of itself can be a little daunting because people are not really comfortable exploring and saying, okay, well, which one will work for me? So if you look at the different waveforms, they just mean there's different parameters. There are different parameters, like different frequencies to each of these. Um, and people just respond differently. So while waveform D, I may feel really focused when I'm using waveform D. I may someone else may get really sleepy with waveform D. And I think some of that is just a little bit of exploration. Um, but all of the waveforms are based on science. They're based on things that we have either conducted research on ourselves or based on published randomized controlled trials that are published online. So that said, you start off, you make sure that the earbud fits really well because you need to have good contact with the skin. And then you run 15 to 20-minute sessions. You can go up to 25 minutes. You can go down as low as 5 minutes, or just, you can end the session anytime. But you increase the intensity until you feel it a little bit in your ear. Now, what's interesting is the trials that are being done are actually being done when people can't feel the stimulation at all, because otherwise you can't blind the
Oh, yeah.
study.
Yeah.
So we work with research partners, and we actually have a research app that allows them to double blind, so no one knows if they're getting the stimulation or not, but it's still running, which
That's
is super
wild.
interesting. It's wild, and it's hard for people to understand that. It's really hard to wrap our brain around that you can be stimulating this nerve with electrical impulses, but they're below the perceptible threshold, so below the level that anyone can feel, and they still physiologically make a difference.
Yeah. I was
So
gonna
the
say,
body's
imagine if they
physiology
didn't.
changes.
Imagine if they actually felt it. Like, I feel like it'd
Right.
be really interesting to compare, like, to have, like, the double blind study, but then also compare it to, like, people's reactions that could feel the stimulation.
Right, that are doing higher intensities. There are some studies that look at that, and we don't see a lot of difference. There are
Interesting.
a couple that are coming out that have come out recently that show that really a lot higher intensities may make a difference for some outcomes. But I will tell you, higher intensities are not comfortable. We've had, we have people go, oh, it, I'll use the word shocking, even though it's not a shock, it's an electrical
Yeah,
impulse. You just turn it down. So you
yeah.
just turn the intensity down, and that's much easier.
And it's like, yeah, it's right on the app. So it's like a little line and then you can click the thing, the plus sign, and it'll go up. But it's gradual. So it's funny. So when I first started using mine like 6 months ago, I had it on like a 20 for my intensity. Like I
Okay.
turned up the intensity pretty high because I'm like, I don't feel it, you know? And now I only need it at like a 10. So
Okay.
I wonder if
Yep.
if it's like it's like created more sensitivity there.
It's interesting because it's actually more related to skin resistance,
Okay.
and sometimes it's hydration. So I'll tell people, make sure you're hydrated. Um, because the way, if you think of how, if your skin is dry and you pinch the skin on the back of your hand, it will stand up,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't snap back. So the skin on your ear has even less tissue underneath it, but you've got to have hydration to make that skin, I don't know, more pliable and easier to maneuver.
Interesting.
So when the electrical stim is going through the skin, then it just kind of depends on, either there are factors like earwax. You obviously have wax in ears, so you need to make sure that you're not trying to get electrical stim through that, but you just wipe the inside of your ear a little bit with a tissue or something, um, and make sure you're hydrated. But some days are different than others. So
Yeah.
some days you may be at a 20, and some days you might be at a 12 or a 10.
Yeah.
That's interesting, though, that over time yours has dropped.
I was like, "Ooh, I just don't need it quite as high anymore, and I can, like, sense it more." But
Hmm.
then it also makes me wonder, like, maybe because I can get into that relaxed state quicker, because 'cause I've been
It could
doing it
be.
more frequently, if that impacted it, but and I know people are gonna ask, so it's like, "Is this safe during pregnancy?" Because obviously I'm pregnant right now as of this recording. What would you typically say to that?
So we talked about this right before the show, but we don't recommend using during pregnancy. But the reason for that is we haven't tested it directly. So there's no real reason that it would be unsafe. But I'm sure you'll nod your head when I say a lot of companies are going to always put the X mark
Yeah.
on pregnant women and children, because nobody wants, I don't want to be wrong,
And it's not
right?
ethical
So
to
if
study
you
them, so
Right, right, exactly. So if you choose to do that, then, obviously that's your choice. And I don't see that there would be cause for concern, but because women's physiology changes so much during
Yeah.
pregnancy, then that's just something we just don't recommend.
Yeah. I felt safe using it, and I knew, like, for me, I knew I was gonna go through a few really stressful seasons. I mean, pregnancy itself is, like, especially your first, you're like, "What's going on? What's happening?" You don't know what to expect. It's a lot. And
It is.
my husband was deployed for 3 months. He's still gone, but he's coming back in 2 days. I can't wait. And so that was super stressful. And then, just having a business and the nature of my work, I know so many people that work from home or they have really busy schedules where they're just constantly behind the computer. I'm doing stuff on my phone for Instagram. I'm like, I just know that for
Mhm.
me personally, I am it's much more common that I'm gonna be in that fight or flight when I am working, and so I find it really helpful to have tools like that. I'm also, like, very, like, data driven, so that kind of stuff, like, really resonates with me, but that's and I was like, I felt safe being like, "Okay, if I know I'm gonna be in this fight or flight more, how can I support myself in coming out of
Mhm.
that?" Because we imprint our nervous systems on our babies, and I'm like, "This poor baby," so I wanted to try to calm myself as much as I could, and I do use it at night, and it was like I find I get into a good nighttime routine, like, with my dogs and stuff. We've got, like, their routine, we use the red lights, like, a whole thing, and then the Zen kinda just fit into that really well for me, and it would just I noticed, like, I slept better when I used it, like, much
Yeah.
deeper. I would sleep through the night, and that's something I hear a lot from pregnant women. Obviously, hydration is huge for that. If you're
Mhm.
drinking too much water, you're gonna be constantly peeing. You need to put minerals in your water, drink adrenal cocktails, all that good stuff. But if you're stressed and like being in more of a stressed out state all day, that's going to also impact your stress patterns at nighttime. So there's so many
Yep.
different possible ways to use it.
Yeah, we hear so often sleep is like the number one benefit that we hear, that people are falling asleep faster, staying asleep longer, getting into deep sleep. And I've talked to people who it makes me wonder if sleep medication becomes a habit in and of itself. But I've talked to people who were on sleep medication for years and they were able to wean themselves either off or to where they barely need those types of medications. So, and as a nurse, I'm sort of biased against sleep medicine because I've seen so many injuries, like weird, horrible
Um,
injuries based on people who have been taking sleep medicine and were sleepwalking or really groggy or kind of hungover in the morning and, just some really catastrophic things. So I'm a little biased.
Especially working in the ICU, I'm sure.
Yeah. Right. If you know that those are bad injuries, if you know that they're coming into the ICU.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so I wanted to talk. You guys have a post, and I'll put this in the show notes. Neuvana has a post on their Instagram about pelvic floor dysfunction and vagal
Mhm.
tone. And this is a topic that I've had a pelvic floor PT on here. It comes up a lot outside of pregnancy, during pregnancy, after menopause, that then you have another whole shift in your hormones in your pelvic floor. Can you talk about that connection between our pelvic floor and that vagus nerve?
So I'll preface by saying that it's really easy for me to be an expert in some things, and some things have been a little bit surprising
Mhm.
along the way. And pelvic floor is one of those that was I had never considered. So if you look at my background as an ICU nurse, I'm focused on everything that is really on the verge of life and death. So pelvic floor, not one of those things. So when, I there was a physical therapist who reached out and said that she had these patients with really, really complex pelvic floor issues. And she thought that the vagus nerve, that toning the vagus nerve would help. Well, I actually was curious. Of course, it made sense to me when I
Yeah.
thought about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I never really thought about that. So I'll give you the anecdote of a couple of her experiences that were related to constipation.
Okay.
Okay, so these are people who, again, with type A personality, maybe whatever is unresolved and a lot of stress, and they were never able to let go of their bowels. So, vagus nerve stimulation, it took several weeks, but really being able to stimulate the vagus nerve and release all those relaxing hormones and neurotransmitters that are intended, like these are the way that our bodies are intended to work, we're actually able to help some people get through this horrible constipation. And, you know, constipation is one of those topics that's really uncomfortable to talk about in public, but it's so real and everyone knows how miserable it is. So I can't imagine being really with such a chronic situation that is really so treatable. And in this case, the way that our bodies work, back to the two sides of the nervous system, when you're so sympathetically overloaded, or like you said, over time, our with age, you mentioned menopause,
Yeah.
and with age, our vagal tone actually decreases. So it just naturally decreases. So you need to do something to stimulate it. I, I'm actually sort of in that pre-menopause area, and I used to get hot flashes. That's why I knew something was going on. I'm like, okay, I know what this is. But I have to say, I don't really get them very often at all. I mean, it is rare. And then I have to think about it. If I get them, then I think about it. I'm like, okay, what's going on in my life? What changed?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't getting them for so long. And I've gotten some feedback from other women who have used the device. And am I saying that vagus nerve stimulation fixes hot flashes? No, but I do think that balancing things out may help,
Well,
right?
it'll
So,
impact your hormones, and that's
right.
that shift in hormones is what causes the hot flash, so I think that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think, related to pelvic floor, um, if you look at the way the body is designed, and even as we age, if things are going to get less resilient, then whatever we can do to support the resilience, or whatever we can do to contradict what we're doing to our bodies with that added sympathetic tone, then that's going to make a difference.
And if anyone's like, "What does your pelvic floor have to do with constipation?" It's because our pelvic floor muscles, they hold things in, but they also let things out. And we did a whole podcast episode on this with my friend, Dr. Ryan Bailey. And yeah, if you have a really tight pelvic floor, then you can also that can not only is it going to lead to maybe some leaking issues, incontinence issues, but also it can lead to constipation because it has a very close tie and all those muscles are connected. But yeah, I just was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I love that they looked into that because that makes
Yeah.
sense that like it's another component of how that can change over time as you age. Like there's hormonal shifts that impact your pelvic floor muscles. But then if you also take into consideration, like, I mean, you've been under stress longer, right? You've lived longer. So you've been
Mhm.
through more.
Right.
And then of course that's your nervous system state can also impact that pelvic floor, but then your hormones. And it's that they're all going to be connected. So that's really, I'm going to link that post just because I was like, oh, this is really neat. And I have so many people that listen that deal with pelvic floor issues. And it's like we know that stress is a component, but I think to see it is really cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Definitely. So, thank you so much for being here and answering all our questions and teaching us about the vagus nerve and this really cool tool, Zen. I'm going to link Neuvana's website and their Instagram. They have a lot of great information there. Really great posts that'll get you kind of thinking and hopefully educate you a bit more. And then I do have a coupon code where you guys can get a discount. It's just Amanda10, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. Anything you want to leave people with?
I would say at I hope that people are looking at whatever you can do to make your life better today, tomorrow, the next day. Just do little things and celebrate your little wins, and tomorrow's a new day. So whether today goes great or whether today goes awful, tomorrow's a new day, and it's okay to forgive yourself for whatever you didn't do today and just get going tomorrow, but do something.
I love that. And it doesn't have to be anything big, it can be something small. And the more you keep doing that
Right.
little
Little.
thing, the easier it's going to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Amanda. This was fun. I knew it was going to be a good talk, so thank you for your time.